Today I'm going to go see a boxing coach at a local boxing club to talk about coaching philosophy, warm-ups, practice design, constraints, etc, etc. So hopefully we get something interesting out of the conversation. I can predict I'm going to get some comments about my height in this video. Now, yes, I could blame the camera, I could blame the angle, but no, I am not a tall person, and the coach was a fairly tall person, so there's a big difference. The first part of our conversation was probably one of the more interesting for me as of right now, because we discussed warm-up and time in practice, time doing the thing. For me, with an hour-long session, I've been told through the course that I'm doing that 10 minutes warm-up needs to be beforehand and on the floor, not on the trampoline. And what the coach was talking about when it comes to boxing is maybe you do boxing a warm-up for skipping, and then you've got skipping instead of actually boxing, then maybe shadow boxing and using pads, and that's very different from the actual sport, the actual game of boxing with someone to perceive and act with or against, and reacting to a person is very different from boxing against yourself, shadow boxing. And this was a theme throughout the conversation. Even though I was coming from mainly a trampoline perspective and he was coming from a boxing perspective, we still had the same language that we were talking about, just using different examples. So ecological dynamics, ecological psychology, and coaching literature is what we were talking about through different experiences, and that's why I love having conversations with other coaches, not just coaches in my sport. I'm working on a video at the moment about warm-ups. If it's out, I will put it a link up there. If it's not out, then it will go up there when it's out, which should be soon. But this relates to representative practice design, the potentiation part of the RAMP protocol, which is fairly popular in warm-ups. Generally speaking, the potentiation phase is trying to build up intensity of an activity to make it as close to the activity before you get there. So instead of running, you'd walk and then slowly jog and then run. And building that up throughout either simplified tasks or using task constraints to build up the readiness of the individual to start training or practicing said sport. Looking at the video, you can see the gym it's big, but it's not huge, so having lots of people in there can be quite constraining with moving backwards or moving forwards. So doing any sort of warm-up or any sort of practice activity, there is an immediate space constraint, which is an interesting point to talk about when it comes to the skills that the individuals in that gym start developing, because they get very good at things that are sort of close quarters, but I imagine they're not so good at moving around a ring when there's lots of space. And with the space constraint, if you're going to potentiate and warm someone up for an activity, you obviously in that room, if you're going to do something like skipping, you've got to be careful you're not hitting other people. If you're going to be moving around, again, you need to be careful you're not hitting other people. So depending on the numbers in the room, you're immediately constrained by what sort of warm-up you can, can't, should, shouldn't do. And to be completely blunt, coaching is still a business, so you still need numbers in the door to be able to pay for the facility. So the session, the potentiation warm-up that maybe is more effective might not be doable because of the numbers required to make the session feasible. This is one of those balancing acts between business and coaching effectiveness in just normal everyday sport. And in this next part of the conversation, we were talking about representative practice, but when you're boxing, obviously representative practice would say you box with someone, but if you're hitting someone in the head, obviously that is physical exertion, that's potentially trauma, that's a lot of hits to the head. If there's lots of repetitions, whether it's repetition without repetition or just the same thing, it's still a lot of blows to the head, which is unsafe. And this raised an interesting point of conversation when it comes to training load. In rugby and football, they're looking to reduce, like heading in football. They want to reduce the amount of headers in football at certain ages, at certain abilities, and in rugby, certain tackles, whether it's non-contact or tag rugby instead of full contact rugby. In boxing, instead of shadow boxing, maybe tapping. Well, that's not entirely representative. So how much of the practice time is fully representative and how much is abbreviated and to what extent? I'm not sure where the biological markers are. I don't think there are any that we could use, but there's certainly ethical considerations that get involved here. And because we're thinking about load in trampoline, being a heavily plyometric sport, there's a lot of load that goes through the body when you're doing big skills, like double somersaults, triple somersaults potentially, even single somersaults or just bouncing for some individuals is a lot of load that goes through the body. So instead of it being, oh, we're just going to coach the sport, now we are the strength and conditioning coaches for those individuals that are taking part in the activity. So we need to bear in mind, okay, Yes, we want it representative, but we need to mediate, we need to moderate, we need to monitor in some way how much load that they're doing. Therefore, the periodized training plan that I would use in a strength and conditioning gym or scenario actually should be, I would argue, applied to our coaching sessions. So maybe one of the constraints of the session is the amount of load, physical, emotional, whatever terms you want to put there, load on the individual. So maybe it's a low load session, which therefore is going to change the type of practice, the type of representative practice, or the goals, the targets, the practice session is. It's going to change what the goal, the target is. Something I would also add in there is whatever the person is doing beforehand. So before the day, maybe they went to work before the session, or maybe yesterday they went for a run, or who knows what their actual week, their day, their week is like. So in some way measuring whether it's RPE, rate of perceived exertion, some sort of counter movement jump, measure of fatigue may also be useful. This is something I did in my strength and conditioning masters, a measure of fatigue before the session to work out what sort of session is going to be more effective, because if the target, the goal of the session requires a lot of energy and a lot of effort, and that person is already mentally, physically fatigued and drained, then maybe the session should be adjusted, in which case the goal, the target, the plan needs to be shifted. Then when talking about the target, the point, why you're doing this, the point of the practice, there was a lot of conversation about questions, how to question, what to question, when to question, why to question, and I think this was partly because of my ignorance. I don't box. I don't really know much about boxing apart from you got two people in a ring, they got gloves and they try and hit each other. That's the extent of my boxing knowledge. But I feel that helped me in the conversation, because when the coach was talking about, we do this session, this practice session, not necessarily a drill, but it's a session, they do a jab to counter punch, and there was terminology brought in. And so I asked, well, what is a jab? What classifies a jab? What classifies a counter punch? Can you set up an environment with tasks, a goal, tap that person, hit that person, there's your target zone, don't let them do this, give them a target goal without using the jab, counterattack, counterpunch terminology. And for me, I think this shifts the learner experience from I need to do this thing, get this technique, do this thing right, or don't do this thing wrong. Instead of that, it's I'm going to explore how to solve this problem that the coach has set up using constraints in the practice environment. As I discussed with the coach, using this language of, okay, what are you paying attention to? What's the intention? What was the point of that? And the more significant one for me, how does that feel? How did that feel to you? Was that better or worse than the one before? Why was it better or worse than the one before? Getting them to explain knowledge of their experience, knowledge about-ish, helps me understand what they're attuning their attention, their focus to. Because I can say something as a coach, or I can guide them to an answer to a question that I want them to answer, but if they're not paying attention to that thing at the time, it doesn't matter. Like, if they are trying to not get hit in the face, and you tell them, you want to move your feet backwards, well, maybe that's not what they're worried about. Maybe it's, I want to just move my head out of the way. Where I think this is interesting from a holistic coaching perspective is the shape of the conversation. Is it a question asked by the coach to get an answer that they're looking for, to get the desired behavior that they want to see from the individual? Or is it asking the individual, okay, what's your experience? What do you think would be better or worse? What's a different way to problem solve this? Or, more significantly, do you need a different way to problem solve this? Because maybe what they're doing works. And if it works, why would they change it? Like, what is the reason for them to change it? That, for me, is probably the most significant thing I think about when I'm asking questions or talking to any individual. What reason do they have to change the current solution if it's doing what I've asked them to do? If they're doing it, why would they point their toes if they don't need to point their toes to get to their feet? I would need to add something or constrain something in some way to the task, but I don't want to heavily constrain it because now, there's only one solution. You can only do it in one way, and that won't work for all of the other possibilities. If, on a trampoline, they move forwards, the takeoff's going to be different. If they move backwards, takeoff's going to be different. If they do a back somersault before the skill or a front somersault before the skill, it's going to be different. So I can't heavily constrain it so there's only one solution, but I don't want to leave it completely open so they can do what they want, because they'll just find the simplest solution, because that's what everyone does. Now, talking with the coach at the end, we actually decided that it might be useful for me to go to the session and sort of interact and see what the session is like, because we're only talking abstract here. And I think looking at the session might be more useful and applicable for coaches, educators, other individuals that are looking at potentially how to learn or how to coach themselves, whatever skills they are. So that's the plan for the future anyway.